There is no self-policing today, nor would it be possible. Charlie Sykes is sort of trying that from his own, in his own individual way, but there's no, dominant figure like a William F. Buckley. And with the internet, I don't know that there ever could be.
All right, folks, welcome to the Shorenstein Center Speaker Series. It is my pleasure to welcome Jackie Combs back to the Shorenstein Center. She is the Whitehouse editor for the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau. She was previously a national correspondent for the New York Times, covering politics and policy. Prior to that, she worked at the Wall Street Journal for 18 years, where she covered Congress elections and the Clinton and Bush administrations, often focused on fiscal policy. She was a fellow here in the spring of 2015, and I'm going to just read to you the last line of her fellows paper. I leave wiser for my time at Harvard, of course, but still puzzled as to how anyone could call the period that includes February to April a spring semester.
If any of you were here in the winter of 2015, you remember 9 feet of snow.
Not exactly spring-like weather. Her paper when she was here, called They Don't Give a Damn About Governing, Conservative Media's Influence on the Republican Party, is without a doubt one of our most popular papers of all time. It really is an exceptional read. I recommend it to all of you. In many ways, it completely anticipates the current moment. And I'm going to start there by asking Jackie, in the paper you describe this dynamic between conservative media and Republican politicians, where given the influence and reach and audience of conservative media, the Republican elected officials overpromise to those audiences and then find themselves unable to deliver, and then get wrapped up in a site where their audiences get angry they can't deliver, and it just intensifies. So talk to us about that. That seems like an excellent way to understand a lot of what's happening right now.
Absolutely. First, thank you very much for having me back here. I absolutely loved it here. That I've said to people, and especially people who say something to me that are down about Donald Trump being at the head of government now and governing with a Republican-controlled Congress, so that you have all Republican control ostensibly in Washington. And I say to them that there is a silver lining in this as far as I'm concerned, which gets exactly to your point, which is they have exposed after 9 months the fact that they have been overpromising for over 7 years, and that the things they were promising were always unachievable, but they were thrown out there as red meat, encouraged by conservative media, and now we've seen, and included first and foremost, repealing Obamacare, defunding Planned Parenthood, balancing the budget while also having big tax cuts, and repealing on day one the orders that of President Obama for the deferred action on childhood arrivals, the DACA protections from deportation for young people brought here to this country as children. None of those things have been done, nor I would say would they be done. And I won't just, I'm wrong about many things in the course of my career, but I actually had a fellowship in February at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, and it was entitled, my weeks there were entitled Policy in the Trump Era, and we covered taxes and trade and health care, and I think everyone came away from those forums and panels with we pretty much predicted, myself and my panelists who were from both ends of the spectrum, or both parties, that these things were not going to happen, chief of all, repeal of Obamacare. And we tried to explain why, but this gets to the overpromising. They have willfully overpromised for 7 years to feed this beast, and I don't know if they just never thought that they'd be called upon to have to do it and, control both the presidency and Congress, or if they just, I tend to think what they thought is they're just thinking short term. Politics and stock markets, stock investors think short term. It's only the immediate win, not the long haul.
What do you how do you see this dynamic changing? This dynamic of the conservative media, which is fueled by outrage, which generates audiences and advertising dollars, which in turn shapes the Republican Party and moves Republican leaders consistently to the right.
Well, to use a loaded word, I think it's only going to get worse. And I say worse because at bottom I think these trends, these forces are bad for democracy. What we have, and just as with mainstream media, when Trump talks about it, conservative media is now it was when I wrote about it, it is even more now. It's broader than just, you know, if I'm painting with a broad brush here in a negative way, there are good conservative media outlets, and including on, you know, the one most people think of most, Fox News. There are good features and good people at Fox News. They just aren't on Fox and Friends, which is what our president mostly watches, but it's just my little aside. So I think it's, you know, this has all come about because it's the age of the internet. It's the expansion of these media forces, because you don't have to have all the wealth and resources that it used to be required or are still required for starting and maintaining a newspaper or a television station. And it's why, you know, we think so much of conservative media, we think of talk radio, but that is sort of declining, except not insignificantly in rural areas where much of Trump's base is. But it's more now on the internet, and there are forces. I didn't even know until I started my paper 2 years ago what Breitbart was. Now everybody knows what Breitbart is. Breitbart was and is in the inner circle of the President of the United States. So I just think this is a force that's only going to continue to worsen, which is that people are going to sources of information that validate the biases they already have, not for information, but for validation. And that is where I come back full circle to saying, well, I think it's a threat to democracy.
In your covering of Washington and the Congress, you have, you have Mitch McConnell, who, when Barack Obama was elected president, said he was going to thwart the president's agenda at every turn.
Make him a one-term president.
Make him a one-term president. That was Mitch McConnell's goal. And then now you have Steve Bannon leaves the White House and announces he's going to war against Mitch McConnell inside the Republican Party. You know, to what extent do your sources on Capitol Hill and the Republican Party, to what extent are they aware of the way they've allowed this, even encouraged this dynamic to develop?
They are aware. Because as I said in the paper, the topic of my paper came about from a luncheon discussion with Trent Lott, the former Republican Senate Majority Leader of Mississippi, when he was despairing of his party's increasingly rightward drift and complaining that conservative media was a big part of it. So it came to me in that way, and but I say, I came to the Shorenstein Center, and at that point I'm a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, and I'm thinking, who's going to read a paper or take seriously a paper written by a reporter for the New York Times that's going to be critical of Republicans and conservative media? So, you know, I didn't want to be dismissed out of hand, so I decided at the outset to mostly interview Republicans, which is what I did except for a few academics. There's one Democrat I quote, and only one Democrat I interviewed, who, David Price, congressman from North Carolina, who happens to also be a political scientist, and I think an all-around good and smart and thoughtful guy. So anyway, what I say in my paper is I was surprised by how many of the Republicans I interviewed were A, willing to be interviewed, B, talk on the record, not all of them did, but a lot, and to fess up to this feeling of that they were, as one put it, creating a monster. You know, they had this tiger by the tail that was turning and devouring them. And, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but every time someone suggests in my presence that Trump is an aberration or some kind of a surprise, I say no. I mean, he is the direct result of forces that were underway for
A natural
2 decades.
conclusion.
Yeah.
A natural, or not even conclusion, a natural waypoint.
Right.
in
You
this
mentioned
journey.
Bannon and what Bannon's doing now to find opponents for Republican candidates. He was doing that 3, 4, 5 years ago. He was doing it from Breitbart. At the time that Donald Trump brought him into his campaign last summer, it was only last summer, I mean, the summer before last, he was fresh off an effort at Breitbart to foment a leadership challenge to Paul Ryan. And Donald Trump, and so this was so unheard of at the time that the nominee of the party would bring into his campaign someone who was from his perch in conservative media trying to unseat the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives. But that's where we are.
Charlie Sykes was a noted conservative talk show radio host in Wisconsin who just published a book, How the Right Lost Its Mind. And, I don't think anyone would say that Charlie Sykes is liberal or even mainstream, per se. And yet, he's come out pretty hard on against what he regards as kind of the way conservative media and the conservative movement has abandoned some of its core principles. Mm-hmm. And yet, even in doing so, he seems ignored by that side. He seems like here is a leader in conservative media who is trying to change the direction of it in a way that's consistent with his principles, the principles he's long espoused, and is being ignored. So what do you make of that dynamic?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's being ignored, because I think a lot of people in this room probably know the name Charlie Sykes, for instance, and didn't 2 years ago. I only learned about him when I was here doing my research. Actually, I'd read about him, and I recommend, if anybody's interested, when Charlie Sykes was one of the conservative media sort of universe and was part of the... He not only is trying to stand up with his principles now, he is sort of doing mea culpas about his role in this dynamic about, creating this monster, creating an audience of people who have little respect for facts, just want to talk about opinion and in a way that validates their opinion. Charlie Sykes, there was a good article featuring him by some journalist I really like a lot, Alec McGillis. And I don't know if it was in Atlantic or the National Journal, but he used, his focus was on Charlie Sykes and another Milwaukee-based conservative talk show host. And it was really critical. In fact, it was critical of them implicitly, but it was also caused Charlie Sykes to sort of see himself as, in a way that now he sort of had this change of heart, or to see that he was contributing to these forces that were bad for conservatism and the country more broadly. Anyway, so I thought about doing Charlie Sykes when I was here. This was actually before he'd had his change of heart, because that really came about during the presidential campaign year. And I ended up going with Steve Deace, a guy based in Des Moines. So I've watched Sykes I watched him closely. I watched him while I was here. But this thing, I think it is, you see that, and when we talk, again, not to paint conservative media with a broad brush, is there are a lot of people in conservative media, Deace is another one, who, like Sykes, are not fans of Trump, because they do recognize conservative media is not monolithic. It's shown 2012, 2016, 2008, they never have been able to form around one single presidential candidate in the Republican Party. It's not even a question of Democrats, of course, but so there is a difference of opinion, and Trump has really split the ranks for the very reason you get at, which is how you hew to the principles of the party, or you just play to the populism.
In your paper, you talk about Stephen Colbert had kind of, when he had the Colbert Report, was fond of the word truthiness, right? To describe something he felt was true, kind of regardless of whether or not it was true.
Right.
How do you describe in the paper kind of a more detailed understanding of that epistemic closure?
Yeah. I love that. I came across that in my research. It's the worst phrase in the world, right? Epistemic closure. I think I wrote in the paper something like, it's by, I have made a note, Julian Sanchez at the Cato Institute. And he wrote this in 2010, which is, again, an indication of how long these forces have been recognized as a dangerous thing on the right. And he provoked in 2010 a really big debate on the right about this. And I first saw a reference to it in the New York Times. I think we wrote about it in 2011 or so, maybe it was late 2010. Anyway, so he came up with this phrase, which is like I wrote, is just designed to have it not catch on, which it, of course, did not. But truthiness, it did. And they mean sort of the same thing. But I'm going to read you what Julian Sanchez, that this gets at this idea. The idea of epistemic closure, in case it's not obvious, which it wasn't to me, is that there's been this news loop, quote-unquote news, a information loop that conservatives have closed themselves in that doesn't allow for outside information or facts to intrude. And if facts do intrude, it's generally they can be dismissed by saying, oh, that was in the New York Times, so of course it's not true. But Julian wrote in 2010, like I say, that this expansion had created expansion and success of conservative media had created a closed information circle harmful to conservatism. He says, quote, reality is defined by a multimedia array of interconnected and cross-promoting conservative blogs, radio programs, magazines, and of course Fox News. Whatever conflicts with that reality can be dismissed out of hand because it comes from the liberal media and is therefore ipso facto not to be trusted. The result, Sanchez said in a subsequent piece as this debate went on with other conservatives, conservative media, quote, had become worryingly untethered from reality as the impetus to satisfy the demand for red meat overtakes any motivation to report accurately. And that was 7 years ago. So.
And that's part of the dilemma of the Republicans, and arguably a pretty conservative part of the Republican Party controls all three branches of the government at this point. And yet a primary voice, primary motivation in that political dynamic, the conservative media, exists frequently outside of, or not always, but frequently untethered from this reality. How does that? I just can't figure out how Republicans on Capitol Hill, Republicans in leadership, are going to navigate this.
Well, clearly they're not very well. And, you take something as basic to Republican ideology and doctrine as tax cuts. First of all, I'm not going out on a limb to say they talk tax reform, there will be no tax reform. They cannot do it. There will be tax cuts at some point. It won't be, but even that won't be easy because it's going to come at the expense of another promise they've always made, which is fiscal responsibility and balanced budgets. They've already signaled that. But, then you're going to have the people like Corker who have served notice that if it adds a penny to the deficit, they won't be for it. Anyway, so even tax cutting is going to be hard for them. So they're not doing this. They're not doing well. And you take, it's even more dangerous than that because now that they control all of government, you get, like Mark Levin, the famous conservative radio talk show host, has said a couple years ago in a show right before Boehner was forced out as Speaker of the House, that this was after 2014 when Republicans had also taken control of the Senate. And he was complaining that Republicans in Congress are voting for things like, as he put it, continuing resolutions, increases in the debt limit, and there was a third thing, a budget bill. Well, what he was describing were the only must-do pieces of legislation that any Congress faces. And to say, this goes to the overpromising, that Republicans shouldn't be voting for those things, is to say, all right, we might as well shut down the government and default. And so when faced with those forces, it makes it so hard. There is going to be, by December 8th, a crisis, because that's when the CR expires, and it'll be shortly after. They can push off, the debt limit won't be a problem until into the new year. But the Republican Party, as a result of these forces, is not a governing party, and Republicans will tell you that. I'm sure you hear that, right, Donna, on the set and you too, Karen. I mean, it's terrible.
What was your first political beat?
Very, very first?
Yeah, sure.
Well, that was in Abilene, Texas, and it was a wet-dry election when I didn't even know what the terms wet-dry meant. But even though I'd gone to graduate school in Evanston, Illinois, which was the home of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, I thought wet-dry elections were a thing. You know, it died in the 20s with the end of Prohibition. But no, I was a 23-year-old woman, Irish Catholic, liked my beer, and I moved to Abilene, Texas, where there was. So we had a wet-dry election, and so my first story actually was showing up for what they said would be the routine canvassing of this vote, because the wets had won, the Southern Baptist dries had lost, and I'm very happy about that. And not to show my bias coming to the story, but I show up at the commissioner's court, and they told me to be pro forma. I had written the story, left it with them, and it was an afternoon paper, so the deadline was like 12:30 p.m., long before the internet. And so I get to commissioner's court, opens at noon. This judge, the chief commissioner, says he has decided there was an irregularity in precinct box 9, I remember to this day, and which overturned the results of the election. He was, as we say, in the pocket of the dries. And so for the next 9 months, it was on appeal. It became a national story. The networks came in like they too didn't know that there were still places that were dry. But I almost wanted to cry, and I had to rush to a phone with my dime at the time and call and say, hold the presses, and dictate a new lead and the top of a new story that was completely the opposite of what I had left them with. So that was my first longer answer than you expected. But
And what was your first beat in D.C.?
Congress. I worked for Congressional Quarterly, and 33 years ago. And then I went to the Wall Street Journal, and then to the New York Times.
And could you see, when you started reporting in D.C., could you see some of these trends in conservative media in the Republican Party? Were there hints of this?
Not immediately, because the forces that unleashed this were not on the horizon. Well, they were on the horizon, but beyond where I could see. The first event was the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, I would argue, in 1987 at the end of the Reagan administration, which made it possible that the following year, 1988, Rush Limbaugh started his show. And he was able to go national and say whatever he wanted and have no one claim that they wanted equal time. And at the same time that was happening, it may seem like a small thing, but it was a big factor at the time. There was a national, 1-800 number, so he could call in. He could have, audience, which made him especially popular, and other people modeled themselves after him. The second thing, of course, was the development of the internet, which made it possible for so many people to open to go online and be publishers. And of course, I'm leaving out 1996, Roger Ailes founds Fox News. So cable, end of the Fairness Doctrine, national call-in numbers, cable, and internet.
When did you first start to see it really impacting elected officials? When elected officials were more concerned about conservative media than they were about constituents or mainstream media?
Easily, the 1994 midterm elections, when Republicans, for the first time in 40 years, won total control of Congress. And throughout that election year, there had been, the imitators of Rush Limbaugh had come into being, and Rush Limbaugh himself was, like I had said at the outset, was so prominent in helping them to win that they made him an honorary member. which I want to add as an aside, that shows you a real difference between now and then, which is that conservative media was in cahoots with the Republican leadership. Now we see they've gone completely opposite. So that was it, and it was in, and then when the Republicans, on their first day, January 1995, John Boehner, again, ironically, considering what a role conservative media would have in pushing him out 20 years later, forcing him to resign. He was a junior member of the leadership, House Republican leadership, and he created what they called Radio Row, which they had all these conservative talk show hosts come in and just set up in the halls of Congress. And you should have seen the members of Congress, the Republican members. They were so starstruck. These conservative talk radio people had become such celebrities in their districts or nationwide that they were like the star. They were usually they would, in their lives it was the other way around, where people were like impressed by a member of Congress. No, it was the other way around.
I have one more question, then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. So get your questions ready. But I did want to ask you about race in conservative media. That one of the concerns, critiques of Breitbart and of especially online conservative media is the way it handles race. And we saw with President Trump, the way he speaks about immigrants and Judge Curiel, to the way he responded to the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. How do you understand and make sense of the role race plays in conservative media and how that might have changed over the time you've been watching it?
I haven't seen that it's changed a lot. It's been an undercurrent, not least because the most popular and most numerous outlets for talk radio are throughout the South and rural areas, conservative rural areas. There's a history of this, though, where conservative media in its pre-internet manifestation and post-World War II mainly there was a great undercurrent of racism through the Civil Rights era. It was a very controversial thing. A lot of these, it was sort of used to tar conservative media generally, but they were voices for segregation and states' rights, and there was a lot of, I think it helped, as I recall, it helped to, in a different world then, where it wasn't considered mainstream or acceptable to talk like that more broadly. It was used against them, but and I think it kept down conservative media. William F. Buckley, even though he himself came for criticism about his own views on race and racial justice, was objected that people were using the race against, or like tarring all of them, including him, with a brush that more was limited to these southern outlets. Now it's more, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's become more acceptable in civil discourse, civic, for people to express views about race than it ever was virtually in my lifetime, and so that's being reflected in some of conservative media. And Breitbart has, I forget what they call it, but they have a subhead. They've had it for years about black crime or something like that. Does anybody know? I've forgotten what it is, but it's just like. And the man who headed that publication was a senior strategist in the Whitehouse just recently, and still talks to him as recently as yesterday.
Rereading your paper, one of the things you spent some time on in the paper is Sandra Fluke, Sandra Fluke, and
Which seems probably nobody remembers that anymore.
I had
It
totally
was huge.
forgotten that the size and scope of that controversy with Rush Limbaugh, and it almost seemed quaint in the face of our current president.
Yeah.
And I just wonder too, in addition to the threads about race in conservative media, how Rush Limbaugh recovered from that.
Well, initially, to say
Or I don't
he
know.
wasn't like thrown on his.
Well, advertisers were
Yes,
dropping him,
it
and there was some impact
2012
there.
for anyone who doesn't remember, and the issue was it was an outgrowth of Obamacare and whether the government should be requiring insurers, not just for individual policies, but for employer-provided policies as well, to provide coverage of contraception and contraceptive services as a preventive service, as one of 10 must provide services. So Sandra Fluke had asked to testify before the House on a hearing about this and testify in favor of this mandate for contraceptive coverage, and the House Republicans refused, and so she became a bit of a cause celeb. And Limbaugh really milked this, and he called her a slut and a prostitute on the air and said, she's having so much sex, it's amazing she can still walk. Well, this caused justifiably cause of furor, and at the time, so 3 years later when I'm writing my paper, I was finding when I was interviewing industry consultants that this was still hurting, this was still a factor that had hurt conservative talk radio, that employers, there was a lot of pressure then for advertisers to drop their advertising from Rush, and others as well, and so that has been considered a factor. Of course, I haven't updated it 2 years later, but as of mid-2015, as of May 2015, it was radio industry. 2 consultants I talked to, both separately, said that this had been, and I was actually happy to hear that it had really hurt their advertising and made them a little more cautious. But I think if I did the interview or the research now, I'd find, their advertising is probably stabilized, but they're hurting in any case, and a lot of the money is coming from individual rich people, both on the local levels and the big levels like the Mercers or the Kochs or people like that. Steve Dace, the man I featured in Des Moines, he has a sugar daddy. He wouldn't identify to me, but I found out who it was, and it was a very rich local man in Des Moines who had talked him into leaving the mainstream radio station there, WHO, which is very big, very well known, and got him to leave and start his own syndicated radio show and backed him up financially. And that is happening, I'm finding. Charlie Sykes and other people like that, they were getting money on the side from very conservative people who saw this as a good way to get their views out there.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I can keep going. I have more. All right, no questions I can see, so I'll keep. Tyler.
I'm Tyler Bridges. I'm a Shorenstein fellow.
No, you are.
You've been critical of Rush Limbaugh and
Mhm.
overall the conservative media here today. What would you say if somebody said to you, "You're just expressing the views of liberal bias"?
I would say that I'm expressing the views of all the Republicans that I interviewed, and no, I mean, and that was what I was afraid of in doing my paper. But I would like nothing more for there to be. I used to read Weekly Standard, and before that, Human Events. I read those, and to know what real intellectual conservatism was about. And now this isn't intellectual conservatism. It's not even conservatism in many cases. And so I was very cognizant of that. I mean, it was the danger. I was scared the entire 4 or 5 months I was here, how my paper would come out and how it would be perceived. But I can't say the whole 4 or 5 months, because once I started getting these interviews under my belt, I felt good about it.
What if it's not conservatism? What would you call it?
Well, it's a right-wing populism. It's a knee-jerk populism. And if I could, can I ask you? I mean, you spend all your time. What do you think I'm wrong, or do you think, or what are the voices of the conservative media like, where you've been writing about for years?
Well, so I'm a reporter in Louisiana. I cover Louisiana politics, and I'm very, very mindful of the criticism that you face, or when you write about people. I get criticized in Louisiana as being too critical of the Republicans, and so that liberal bias is.
Right.
I had this question of Bob Schieffer the other day when he appeared before us. How do you do your job and call out these people when you need to call them out, just as you do with Democrats, and not run into that bias that people then facing that you're just another liberal reporter.
Mm-hmm. No, it's hard. I don't know how what I could have done different, and I don't apologize. I'm really proud of my paper, and I think Republicans are increasingly know that it's true, and even Charlie Sykes speaks to it now. It is not a good thing and the other challenge I had in the paper that goes to your question is answering inevitably people are going to say, well, it's the same on the left. It's not the same on the left. And there are reasons for that, and I won't, but there are other forces pressuring people on the Democrats to be more left-leaning. We know that, but this closed conservative circle of information is not one of them.
Yeah, if I could jump in, just if anybody hasn't read the report by the Berkman Institute that talks about how closed much more the right is than the left is, and how much more sort of powerful this ecosystem is on the right than on the left. I think.
Did that just come out recently?
Came out in August.
In August. And we had Yochai Benkler here in the spring talking about it. But you actually cite some of that research in your paper, Jackie, which is that.
I just don't know it.
Which is that the more conservative you are, the more likely that you only consume conservative media. Whereas the more liberal you are, you're still likely to consume a broader, diverse range of media.
And I benefited from the work of the Pew Research organization because they had done a year-long study of Americans' media consumption habits as part of their series on trying to explain the political polarization in this country, and it was really good. And I hope they update it, but I said that to somebody at Pew recently, and they said, well, it takes money.
Richard?
So I really appreciate what you had to say, Jackie. I was just going to ask you to push back a little further, and maybe not fair to ask a reporter to do it because reporters do the first draft of the story. But I'm 70, and I was born in 1946 when Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy were both elected to the Congress, and it's impossible for me to describe that kind of republicanism as a kind of moderate pre-Reagan or pre-radical right republicanism, a tendency toward let me put it differently. A strong radical tendency in the Republican Party has been present in that party for a long, long time. And I think that keeping that in mind is really important, particularly for a younger generation of Americans who somehow see this as a novelty or related to something that has happened recently in American life. I mean, I grew up in Southern California in the 1950s with Birchers, and my hometown voted for Goldwater in 1964. And none of this that so excites the 02138 liberals as if the Huns had suddenly shown up.
Right.
Cut it out.
But was there conservative media?
That's a willful. Well, the conservative media was the mainstream media. 80% of American newspapers from the 1940s to the 1970s always endorsed the Republican candidate.
Yeah,
you don't want to talk about fringe media.
You touched on a real.
With very few exceptions, where there are national print media that could be talked about as left or even progressive. And the New Republic and the Nation were there, but they were hardly major mainstream forces. Henry Luce and the Time people were considered progressive by the standards of a lot of the stuff. You can look at the Saturday Evening Post or Collier's coverage of the politics of the 1950s and the way that Stevenson was treated versus the rapturous way in which Joe McCarthy in his early days was treated. It's just nonsense to talk about this as a novelty. And then there were fringe media. There was Father Coughlin in the 30s, and you had the Klan media of various kinds. The Klan was among the very earliest users of broadcast radio in the 1920s. I mean, the far right has always been technologically innovative.
Right.
And so I think that from my vantage point, I would just encourage more of a discussion that shows continuity rather than
Right.
discontinuity or novelty, and then try to think in the context of continuity, well, how to address this as an issue of a recurrent feature of American public life.
Well, and
I'm
in
sorry,
my
I
paper,
went on too
no,
long.
to buttress your point, in my paper I cited how in 1961 things were so bad in terms from some commentator on the right that both John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower, who had just left the presidency, were moved to condemn what they saw as the divisive extremist talk of self-styled super patriots. Sound familiar? The liberal magazine in the Nation in 1964 drew wide notice for an article on conservative radio that it entitled "Hate Clubs of the Air." That was 1964. And with the civil rights era, liberal and mainstream media pointed out the overtly racist programming of some conservative broadcasters, mainly in the South. But it was the extremism of the conspiracy-minded John Birch Society that by 1965 provoked even some within conservative media to speak out. Buckley and the National Review led a break from the Birchites, despite the predictable loss of conservative subscribers and advertisers, for fear that well-educated, responsible intellectuals like themselves would be tarred by association with what Buckley called the kooks.
Can I just one word, which is, you can push even further back to the Second World War, when Roosevelt, after being elected for a third time in the middle of the war, secretly reached out to Wendell Willkie, whom he had beaten in 1940, and encouraged Willkie to think about the two of them leaving their respective parties and forming a liberal party, because Roosevelt was so disgusted by the conservative reactionaries both within the Democratic
Right.
and the Republican Party.
Right.
That's at the height of the war
Right.
in the 1940s.
Which raises the question, I want you to start, if I may. What is different now about it, if anything, about conservative media and its audience?
I would add, I was going to ask you, could Buckley, like, excluding the Birchers or leading like a purge of the Birchers from the party, could you even do that today?
Well, no, and that's why I brought that up in the paper. That's where I touched. There is no self-policing today, nor would it be possible. Charlie Sykes is sort of trying that from his own, in his own individual way. But there's no, dominant figure like a William F. Buckley. And with the internet, I don't know that there ever could be. And so, when Limbaugh said what he did about Sandra Fluke and said, well, I won't repeat the phrase again because it's probably still read. But there was some talk then about, policing, that they, but, able to do it a little bit initially through advertisers, but
To change topic a little bit, what is it like covering this White House?
A lot more fun than Herbert Hoover.
I mean, what can you say? I mean, it is truly unlike anything any of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes, and if we could bring back the dead, they could say the same thing. And I thought I had left daily journalism at the end of 2016 when I left the New York Times, and I was looking at other things, and I ended up getting a couple journalism overtures, and I decided to go back in part because I just thought, in my own way, that I knew that a lot of the reporters covering Trump are young. They'd never covered any other presidential campaign nor any other White House. And so I thought, so I got this offer from the LA Times to be a White House editor, and they had 3 young reporters who fit the description I just said, and I thought, I've covered 3 presidents, I covered Washington 33 years, I've seen these evolutions, I've seen trends, and I am a student of history, so I thought people like me should be in the game. And so I took the job. And but that said, there are some days, I had a discussion with, maybe it was you, Nancy, or maybe you. That was like, some day you just think, it's PTSD, you know, you wake up, my phone is my alarm, and when it goes off, and Trump gets up before me, and I have this alert that I've already got his tweets there on my phone, and I'm like, oh, God, no. And so it's just, the constant negativism is wearing. And it's just, I don't know whether, I try not to, it's unlike anything.
Well, I mean, it seems like there's a challenge, right? That the president's words, the president of the United States, his words are supposed to have some power, some import. And yet he also kind of uses the tweets to manipulate the news cycle in ways that have no bearing whatsoever on the reality sometimes. Right. And so that's like, I think, a real dilemma for covering the president.
Yeah. I mean, we have this debate, and I'm sure you all have an opinion on it as to whether we should be covering his tweets like we do. I fall in the camp of saying, yes, we should. I mean, this is a unique window into the mindset of the President of the United States. And whatever he says, you know, it's like any news that comes, or any developments, information that comes across your desk. You have to decide how and to play it, whether to play it. But his tweets, I tell the few reporters I have, do not become inured to him. Do not become inured to his tweets or anything else about him, because if we do, we are lowering the bar. We have got to maintain the same high bar for him that we maintain for every other president, no matter how many times he distracts us with. I mean, it's become sort of a truism of Washington for people to stand there and say, was it just Monday that he picked the outrage? I can't even keep them straight, but you know that. And
was it just yesterday?
Do you ever worry that by covering him, you're doing exactly what he wants you to do? I mean, that you're being played like a violin.
That's the argument. That's the argument. On the other
thing.
hand, his most recent poll I've seen is CNN's 37% approval rating, 57% negative. Is that what he wants? I mean, the reason that is the coverage of the support for the job he performed on the hurricanes has gone in the course of a month from 64% support to 44%. So the news reporting on him is having an impact.
But Jackie, let me just point out, the Republican Party reported that he didn't even win a majority of the votes in the Republican primaries, let alone win the majority of votes in the general. It's a peculiarity of the American electoral system that someone can win the presidency not meeting either of those conditions of majority rule. The thing that I keep focusing on is that within the Republican Party, there was a furor about Donald Trump. And at the beginning of that cycle, there weren't Republicans who actually thought that Donald Trump had a chance. It was just a brand-boosting exercise by him. By November, 80% of Republicans came back to the Republican Party and chose to vote for Trump. So I don't actually worry about him, and he shouldn't worry about his relatively low numbers right now, because all throughout last summer and fall, they were going, oh my God, he's got awful, we've got to sabotage him, we've got to somehow conspire to derail him at the convention, we've got to ruin him in the fall, and then 80% of the party comes roaring back into the Republican column on that first Tuesday in November. So I wouldn't put too much hope in, his negatives right now as a deterrent to his reelection.
Especially if the left divides and you have a Democratic candidate, say, and a third-party candidate.
Well, the Democratic Party dividing, that's not possible. What do they disagree about the Democratic Party? Don is to my far left, and so.
It's kind of curious to me that in the 9 months or so he's been president, he hasn't appeared on talk radio.
Today he's doing, if he hasn't done it already, on talk radio for the first time. They're doing a radio row, which I haven't heard that phrase since 1995. And they're doing it to push his tax, I don't even want to call it, it's not a bill, I don't even want to call it a plan, his tax idea. Tax proposal, yeah. And so he is on, he's doing some interviews with some talk radio people that have been brought in, and so are some of his cabinet members like Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and National Economic Advisor Gary Cohn. So, which is interesting, but I think this goes to someone among you noted he's a product of TV. I'm not sure he's ever really catered to or listened to talk radio.
Howard Stern.
That's true. I stand corrected. Another great force of conservative intellectualism.
Blame it up to the 21st century.
Donna?
So, Jackie, you mentioned that President Trump is a creation, a direct creation of the monster that was built by conservative media. And so my question is, you know, I start visualizing Popeye, you know, Popeye the Sailor Man, and Popeye would eat spinach and then grow stronger. But what feeds this particular monster? Is it our polarization? Is it our partisanship? Or is it wedge issues like gays, guns, immigration, racial issues? I noticed yesterday the president, and I agree with you about the PTSD factor. But yesterday the president started saying, "Oh, I'm going to get to welfare soon."
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay.
Where did that come from?
Where did that come from? Yeah. So what feeds this particular monster, and what can we do as citizens to not feed into it?
Well, I think the factors you mentioned are the ones that are behind it, and he's, you know, when he sees himself getting, you know, he fails on health care, he's got these other controversies, he's, you know, unraveled DACA, and yet he recognizes and says he wants to preserve it somehow. So he's got these things that are controversial, and so suddenly he's coming out with, you know, provoking yet again this whole controversy over the flag in the NFL, and now throwing in welfare. And he hits these issues every time he gets in trouble just to keep his base going. And it's just remarkable to me. It's like so much about him just defies everything we thought we knew about politics, which is, you know, you win an election and you try to expand your base. He's shown no interest whatsoever. And I'm, you know, I don't even need to say more because I feel like I'm restating what everyone else has said. But
And I apologize, I didn't read your paper, but I will make it part of my must-read unless Tyler invites me out again tonight, in which case I won't have any time to read. But I notice he's dressed up today, so we must be going somewhere. So let's talk about the, you know, you mentioned Southern Baptist. I'm Catholic also, Irish Catholic, so we might be related.
yeah, I think so. Daughters of a different mother.
Absolutely. I would have been with you on the beer. But we didn't talk about the so-called Christian evangelical movement, the Jerry Falwells of the world, who also, right around the time Rush Limbaugh, Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, I mean, all of these forces now seem aligned in such a way that I never thought they could ever come together.
No,
Given the vulgarity of some of the things that the president has said.
Right.
And yet they embrace him as if he is, you know, the second coming of.
Right. That is one thing I can't explain. One of the things when I was reading my paper for seeing how much it stood the test of time, there's a part in there where I talk about how the conservative media, and especially going to the religious right, would be this would be true of them in spades, is that you to not give anybody a pass, no matter how. For instance, Jeb Bush was a far more conservative governor in Florida than Ronald Reagan ever was in California. But when people forget, conservative media was very suspicious of Reagan when he ran for election, and were quick to call him on the carpet during his presidency for when they thought he was not being true to their program. That said, they gave him a pass because they felt like he made them feel like he was one of them, and he was charismatic, and so it was never a crisis of his relationship he had with them. Then you come to a person by 20 years later, 30 years later, it's not like that anymore, and Jeb Bush, who was very conservative, and others would not get a pass for the sole issue of immigration. The religious right was also opposed to a comprehensive immigration solution. Now, then So in my paper, I alluded to that, and I quoted some Republicans saying they won't give anyone a pass. Well, clearly they've given Trump a pass. And I really can't answer myself all the reasons why. It would seem like the Access Hollywood video alone would have been the fatal knife in the coffin, so to speak. I mean, the idea that this guy, with his history, I don't know.
But they got Gorsuch as a Supreme Court justice.
That's true. It's
twice in Louisiana. You know, what disqualifies you just from talking about grabbing pussy?
Well, I
mean,
think it
you gotta
comes-
get really active in the evangelical white community in a kind of a hellacious way to get called down. I mean, Jim Baker got himself reborn again. I mean, there are plenty of evangelical ministers.
That's-
You know, there's a line in Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry where he talks about going behind the altar and ramming the fear of God into the choir mistress. I mean,
That's
it's
true.
It's an old story within
He's an
that.
academic, folks.
Wow.
I'm quoting a Nobel Prize winner in literature, so don't go after me.
While name, I'm a fellow at the center. I wanted to ask you a question about Hillary Clinton. So, and the Russian story. As a reporter, do you feel like the coverage of WikiLeaks, the coverage of the FBI investigation, did the media do anything wrong there?
wow. So you've gotten far afield from conservative media to all the way over to the New York Times. We can always fault the coverage. I think I don't think the coverage of her was, I don't fault it big time necessarily. Was there too much, in retrospect, you can, too much on the email servers and all that. Let me ask you a different question. She didn't give enough of a message to offset that. I'm not sure she could, but I do think people simply didn't think, I don't think, it's not so much how we covered Hillary as how we covered Trump. And I don't think Trump was taken seriously enough to get the coverage, although everything we know about him came out during that campaign, pretty much, except for, of course, the Russia things, and we still don't know.
Do you think, how do you see mainstream media coverage and conservative media coverage changing when we're looking at 2020? Do you think there's going to be any substantial changes in either the conservative or the mainstream media as to how these candidates and these issues get covered?
Yes, but I can't predict what that is. Like 2012, for instance, we didn't know. Twitter was only then coming on the horizon. It's been in my lifetime, and we've come to, it seems so odd now, but the use of the internet, and so I think technology is continually changing, so that will change how things are done. And I think that's why we need to do a lot. And you need the paper you gave me today that I can't wait to read about fake news. I mean, there's got to be we've got to figure out a way to at least alleviate the distribution of what is truly fake news, as opposed to what Donald Trump thinks of as fake news. Because that's the main thing I fear for 2012 or 2018. I fear it for next year's midterms. I fear it already. It's already happening.
On that warm, optimistic note, I want to thank you all for coming. Let's give Jackie a round of applause.